Hello, this is Corey at Nenderlot here delivering a new perspective about slavery. In case you are new to my content, I talk a lot about slavery because I want to understand how we actually can create freedom by understanding what slavery is. And yes, it's just that simple, the education of what slavery is, because most people do not know how to simply define what slavery is, or maybe they do understand, but they may not apply it to our modern world, to the things that we do on a day-to-day basis that potentially could be contributing towards slavery. So I have a book called Slavery Gone for Good, just for some context, that goes over a lot of these concepts. And one of the things that it goes over is the forms of slavery. Okay, now in this video, we're going to look at the types of slavery in relation to the forms of slavery. So we're not going to go over exactly the forms of slavery and all about that, but we're going to look at the types of slavery in relation to the forms. Now, what I mean by that would be internal and external slavery and economic and education slavery. Okay, those are what I refer to as the types of slavery, just as some examples most people use when they refer to modern slavery. Now, when I usually talk about slavery, I talk about only two forms, and that is mental and physical. Now, the reason why I use only those two forms is because I see that transcends basically all the other types and all the other forms. So, for example, if I were to look at internal slavery, being the mind, right? Slave to your, you're internally a slave, where you want to be a slave, perhaps, I can say that's mental slavery. Now, let's say I actually have cuffs on my legs and I can't move, or I'm being forced to do something that I don't want to do against my will. Then that may be called external slavery, even though I usually just call it physical slavery. So internal and external could be used as an alternative for mental and physical. But the reasons why I use mental and physical is because it gets a bit more specific as to what exactly I'm talking about. I'm saying that slavery is a mental condition just as freedom is. That you have to free your mind in order to accept new information, in order to create new actions. In order to be free physically, you have to be free mentally. Because mental slavery is saying, yes, I want to be a slave, and physical slavery says you have to be a slave, right? So once you set up that scenario where you say you want to, well, then you're going to set up a scenario where you kind of pretty much have to, because you invested so much energy into it, and you feel like you can't really escape because you're enslaved. So this is the scenario where a lot of people in today's world are enslaved one way or another. Now, this could be solved, and I go through extensively all about this in my book. It would take way too long to talk about in this video, but if you're interested, I have many videos on those topics. What I specifically want to address is when people say, well, what about economic slavery? What about education slavery? Okay, and aside from the internal and external, which we went over, and I said, well, it's still mental and physical, these two are also mental and physical slavery. Okay, economic slavery, oh my gosh, mentally, I need money. I need to get the money. Oh my gosh, I need to, right? The debt that you're in, perhaps, right? And you have to pay them, but they're expecting it of you. You are basically endowed to them and what they want because you signed up for it. Now you say, well, there might be some voluntary interaction there. Well, again, that goes back into mental slavery. If you think that you are meant to be a slave, if you think you are meant to be economically a slave in this case, right? So mental slavery still persists to economic slavery, and physically, if let's say you don't have a house or you don't have the things that you want, per se, that you may call economic slavery. But when I refer to slavery, I'm referring to the specific action of enslaving another individual, which means using another individual against their will, claiming ownership over them, saying that I own you, your property belongs to me. That is an action. Okay, so when we use this title, economic slavery, we need to understand and break it down into an action. So that's why I use the word mental and physical slavery, and they both refer to actions. And then when I refer to just saying slavery, I usually refer to a condition that was created thereof the actions in manifest. So if enough people are in a state of slavery, mentally or physically, it's going to lead to a slave state, a state of slavery, an institution known as slavery. Otherwise, is it really slavery, or is it just a bully or a thug or somebody who's trying to coerce you, right? It's slavery when it becomes systemic. So slavery in small scenarios may not really even be called slavery, because slavery is referring to an established institution. That is the term that is typically used to talk about slavery. Now, education could be a similar thing, where you have to go to school, you have to do this, you have to follow these orders, you need to stay in line, right? You can say that is all physical and mental because you think you have to be there and you have to get good grades, and it's something that you just feel like you have to do. But again, there's question as to what's actually voluntary, what's not. Is there violence within the process? Because slavery is saying that you are violently under somebody, that you have no choice but to follow them. Okay, but mentally you can say, well, I have no choice. Even if violence is not the answer, you might just still be coerced just by persuasion, just because you are a young individual in the school system and you haven't had a developed reason or conscience ability for yourself, and you have all these other people bossing you around, you fear that there might still be punishment. It may not be violent, but it's still going to be punishment. You don't want it. So it feels like slavery. People are going to refer to these things as slavery because they have a similar nature to that of the slavery I talk about in the literal sense of people literally being chained down, chattel slavery, or government slavery, where their possessions are owned and can be taken at any time based on the whims of the legislators. So these are all different types of slavery. You see how it's sort of a spectrum, a dynamic that needs to be understood at each single level. You can say that every part of it is important: economic, education, internal, external, physical, mental. But ultimately, what I'm going to say to you is that it all comes down either way to mental and physical slavery. It doesn't really matter what form of slavery you want to present to me, because I'm still going to say, well, there is aspects therein which is mental and physical. So another thing to also say is that some people will say, well, you're enslaved to reality. You're naturally a slave. Well, again, when I refer to slave, I'm referring to an act of one individual onto another. If you're enslaved to reality, it doesn't make you a slave. It makes you living in reality, which you're already bound by the laws. You have to follow those laws of reality. If you want to call yourself a slave to reality, go ahead, but it's not really going to change much because you can't change it. That's reality. So if you want to say that you're a slave because you can't change it, even though that's all you ever really know, it's kind of a tricky situation of words. So you can say, yeah, I'm enslaved to reality, but that doesn't justify you being enslaved to a fellow man within that reality when you guys have an equal playing field and the ability to simply live in peace with one another, to not coerce violently upon one another and steal each other's stuff and claim each other's stuff. It doesn't make any sense. So we just need to add sense into this equation, and then it makes it much easier. You can say economic or education slavery is important, but you're ultimately looking at slavery, so don't forget that part. Okay, don't just look at it primarily through the education or the economic, but look at it through just slavery. And of course, when I refer to education, I'm referring to mainstream systems or systems of education. Because in reality, real education is just me like this, talking to you, people teaching, sharing thoughts with others. This is education already. The difference between this and an institutionalized education is that institution may have some coercion as part of it, or there may be some parts of it that are questionable to the average public. And you know what? That public is going to question if they think things are out of hand with their own conscience. But so long as people are using their conscience, then we're okay. So long as people are not engaged in statism, then no problem is aggregated. So there's no issue. There's no mass slavery. There's no institutionalized mass slavery. There's still going to be slavery here and there, like I said. But is it really just an abuse of practices, a bad business practice that people can opt out of, that people are going to speak up against? Because there's not really much violence involved, so it's not really a government. It's not slavery. It's just a bunch of bullies or thugs or people who don't know what they're doing, right? And this happens all the time. But that stuff gets balanced. Government, so long as it's promoted and its authority and statism, will keep ever growing, even when people think it needs to be changed, because the root is still in place, and that is statism, their mental slavery. So that physical slavery is still going to always grow, and that's the difference between government and any other institution like schools and other organizations. Okay, organizations, voluntary hierarchies, there's nothing wrong with that. Government, involuntary hierarchy based entirely upon violence. It's a monopoly on such. It is not okay. It's slavery. Thank you very much for watching. In case you don't agree with me, or you have a perspective to share, please share it with me in the description below. And if you're new to my book or new to my works, feel free to check it out. Thank you. My name is Corey at Ninjalot. Nature's the answer.